The day Maria Whitfield stopped speaking, the sky above Redemption Creek had been the color of old blood, streaked with orange and purple, as if the heavens themselves were too ashamed to look down at what Hugh Barnett had done. That was 2 years ago, and in all the days and nights and seasons that had turned since then, not a single word had passed her lips, not a greeting to the women who brought her soup, not a prayer whispered in the small white church at the edge of town. Not even a scream when she woke from her nightmares, sitting bolt upright in the narrow bed at the boarding house, her chest heaving, her dark hair plastered to the sides of her face with cold sweat. She had locked every syllable inside herself like gold sealed in a vault, and she had swallowed the key. The town of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, was the kind of place that swallowed people whole and spat their bones into the red dirt. It sat along a crooked bend of the Pecos River, ringed by cedar scrub and limestone bluffs, and it smelled perpetually of horse sweat, gun oil, and the sweet sour tang of the saloon that never quite closed. There were 300 souls living there, more or less, depending on whether you counted the drifters who camped along the river and the Mexican families who kept to the southern end of town, and generally preferred to pretend the rest of Redemption Creek did not exist. It was the kind of place where a man's reputation was a fragile and precious thing, and a woman's reputation was even more so, and where silence could mean a dozen different things depending on who was wearing it. Maria Whitfield wore hers like a second skin. She was 26 years old, fine-boned and dark-eyed, with the kind of quiet grace that came not from breeding but from practice, from years of learning how to make herself small in rooms where men were loud. Her father had been a schoolteacher from Virginia who'd come west chasing the idea of a better life, and had found instead a dry goods store that barely paid its debts, and an early grave from a fever that swept through in the winter of 1874. Her mother had followed him into the ground not 8 months later, more from grief than illness, or so the older women of town said when they thought Maria wasn't listening. She had inherited the store and its debts and its small cramped back room where she slept, and she had learned to manage ledgers and inventory and difficult customers with a cool efficiency that earned her the grudging respect of the town's men and the warmer admiration of its women. Then Hugh Barnett had come into her life, and she had believed, God help her, that she was loved. Hugh Barnett, in the spring of 1876, had been 31 years old and the most arresting man Maria had ever seen. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark chestnut hair worn longer than was fashionable, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as the bluffs above town. He rode into Redemption Creek on a gray horse with a silver saddle, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether the world would make room for him. He was a cattle broker, or so he said. He moved herds between ranches across the territory, taking a commission, traveling light and fast. He had a laugh like thunder rolling down a canyon, warm and deep and impossible to resist, and he had turned that laugh on Maria one afternoon when he came into the store to buy tobacco, and she had been helpless against it from that first moment. He courted her the way a summer storm courts the prairie, sudden and total, and impossible to prepare for. He brought her wildflowers he'd picked from the riverbank. He fixed the hinge on the store's back door that she'd been meaning to repair for 6 months. He sat across from her in the evenings on the narrow porch and read to her from a battered copy of poems by Lord Byron that he pulled from his saddlebag, and whether he understood the poetry or not hardly mattered, because the way he read it, slow and careful, as if each word cost him something, made her heart turn over in her chest like a coin spinning in sunlight. By October of 1876, they were engaged. The town was pleased. Maria Whitfield was a good woman who deserved a good man, and Hugh Barnett, whatever roughness lay at his edges, seemed like he intended to be that man. They had planned to marry in the spring. What happened instead in the February of 1877 was the thing that Maria still could not speak of, the thing that had locked her voice inside her chest. It had begun with a letter. She had not been meant to see it, but the postal clerk, old Mr. Tibbets, had handed it to her by mistake, confusing it with a piece of correspondence addressed to the store. The letter was addressed to Hugh Barnett, and the return address was a town called Laramie, Wyoming, and the name in the upper left corner, written in a careful feminine hand, was Mrs. Eliza Barnett. Maria had stood in the middle of her store with that letter in her hands for a very long time. Then she had set it on the counter and gone about her day, because she was not a woman who made scenes, and because there was a part of her that needed to breathe through what she was seeing before she could speak of it. She had given the letter to Hugh that evening, watching his face when he recognized the handwriting. She had watched the color drain out of him and then flood back, watched his jaw tighten, watched the precise moment when he decided what kind of man he was going to be. He had told her then, standing in the dim lamplight of the store, his hat in his hands, that Eliza was his wife, had been his wife for 4 years. He had not lied about this exactly, he had simply never mentioned it. He had told himself, he said, that the distance, the years of separation, the fact that Eliza was far away and the marriage had long since gone cold as stone, meant that it did not count. That what he had with Maria was real and what he had in Laramie was already over, just waiting for papers. He had told himself all sorts of stories, the way men did when they wanted something badly enough. Maria had listened to every word. Then she had walked to the door and opened it and waited without looking at him until he left. She had not spoken since. The town understood, more or less. Some of the women wept for her. The Reverend's wife brought casseroles. The doctor, old Dr. Pulliam, had come by twice to assure her that her silence was a natural response to a terrible shock, that it would pass, that she needed rest and patience and the healing mercy of time. Maria had listened to all of it with her dark eyes steady and her expression composed, and had communicated what needed communicating through small nods and head shakes, and the occasional note written in her neat schoolteacher's daughter handwriting. Hugh Barnett had left Redemption Creek 3 days after that night. He had ridden out on his gray horse with his silver saddle and his battered Byron, and he had not come back, and the town had closed around the gap. He left the way flesh closes around a wound, slowly and not without scarring. The store had kept Maria alive. She had thrown herself into it with a kind of furious precision, expanding her inventory, setting up a small lending arrangement with the bank in Fort Stockton, ordering bolts of calico and sacks of flour and new farm implements from the suppliers out of San Antonio. She had found that she could run a business perfectly well without speaking. Hand gestures and written notes sufficed for most transactions. The women of the town had taken to checking in on her with a warmth that she received gratefully, even when the sympathy in their eyes made her chest ache. 2 years passed. Maria turned 28 in the autumn of 1878. She was still silent, and the silence had become, in its way, a kind of peace. Not a happy peace, but a stable one. She had learned to live inside it. She had learned that you could inhabit a life that had been stripped of something essential and still keep moving, still light the lamp in the morning and tend the fire at night, and watch the seasons turn over the red hills without being destroyed by them. And then, in the April of 1879, Hugh Barnett rode back into Redemption Creek. She heard him before she saw him. She was in the back of the store, checking a new delivery of iron cookware against the manifest, when she heard his horse on the street outside, that particular sound, which she would have recognized from the inside of a thunderstorm, a heavy, unhurried clopping that she had spent 2 years trying to forget. She did not move immediately. She set down the manifest and the pencil and she breathed. Then she heard the bell above the store's front door ring, and she walked out from behind the curtain that separated the back room from the shop floor, and there he was. He looked older. 2 years had sharpened the lines around his eyes and put new ones around his mouth, and there was more gray at his temples than she remembered, though he was only 33 and it had come too fast, the way grief sometimes ages a face. He was dusty from the road, his coat dark with travel, and he held his hat in both hands the same way he had held it on the night she'd shown him the letter, as if he needed something to do with his hands to keep them honest. He did not say anything at first. He just looked at her, and the looking said things his voice hadn't found yet. The store was empty except for the two of them. It was mid-morning, that quiet hour before the midday rush, and the April sun came through the front windows in long slanted bars of gold that fell across the plank floor between them like bars of a different kind. "Maria," he said at last, just her name. 2 syllables, quiet as a confession. She looked at him. She did not nod. She did not write anything on the notepad she kept beside the cash drawer. She simply looked at him with her dark, steady eyes and waited. He swallowed. "I know I have no right to be here. I know that. I'm not here to ask you anything or to expect anything. I just needed you to know some things, and then I'll go if that's what you want." She still did not respond. Her expression was not cold. It was careful, the way a woman is careful when she has learned that carelessness costs too much. He told her then, standing in the same lampless morning light, hat in hands, that Eliza was gone. He said it plainly. She had died in the January of 1878 of a pneumonia that had come on fast and taken her in less than a week. He and Eliza had been legally separated for 2 years before that. The distance between them formalized at last, though she had declined to pursue a full divorce on account of her family's views on the matter. Her death had come as a blow, even so. Not the blow of losing a wife he loved, because the love between them had burned out long before, but the blow of finality, of a door closing on a chapter of his life that he had handled badly and could never now make right to her directly. He had spent the 1.5 years since her death, he said, doing the only thing that seemed to make any sense to him. He had worked. Hard, punishing work, cattle drives up through the panhandle, rough country and rougher men, weeks in the saddle with nothing but the stars and his own conscience for company. He had enough money now to do something real with. He had bought a small parcel of land 2 miles east of Redemption Creek, on the flats above the river, with a limestone house already half built on it and enough pasture for a modest cattle operation. He had bought it 3 weeks ago and ridden to Fort Stockton to record the deed, and now he was here. He was not passing through. He intended to stay. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, and his voice was rougher now, the words costing him something visible. "I know I hurt you in a way that doesn't have an easy remedy. I know what I did was a kind of theft. I stole something from you that I had no right to even touch. And I've lived with that every day since you opened that door and waited for me to walk out of it." He stopped. He looked down at his hat, turned it once in his hands, then looked back up at her. "I just wanted you to know I was here and that I'm sorry. I'll be here if you ever—" He stopped himself again, shook his head slightly as if correcting himself. "No, never mind what I was going to say. That's not fair. I'm here. I'm sorry. That's all." He put his hat back on his head, touched the brim in a small, formal gesture, and walked out of the store. Maria stood in the bars of April sunlight and listened to his horse move away down the street. She breathed. She picked up her pencil and her manifest, and she went back to counting cookware, and she told herself that she was fine, that the counting of cookware was the only thing that mattered, and she told herself this with great conviction all the rest of that morning. But she noticed, that evening, that her hands were not quite steady when she lit the lamp. The next several weeks were a kind of quiet agony. Hugh Barnett settled into the half-built limestone house east of town, with the methodical determination of a man who had decided that useful work was the only available penance. He hired 2 men from town to help finish the construction, the carpenter's son, a young man named Pete Garza, and an older hand named Cy Hutchins, who had worked cattle ranches from here to Colorado and knew how to do most things that needed doing. Hugh himself worked alongside them without pretension, hauling stone and mixing mortar and setting roof beams, and by the end of May the house was finished and weathertight, with 4 rooms and a proper hearth and a covered porch that looked out over the river flats toward the Cedar Hills. He came into the store twice during those weeks. The first time was to buy nails and lamp oil and a sack of cornmeal. The second time was to buy a good length of rope and a pair of work gloves. Both times, Maria served him the same as she served any other customer, efficiently, without excess expression, writing the total on the notepad and accepting his coins without their fingers touching. Both times, he said thank you in the same quiet way and left without lingering. The town watched all of this with intense interest and considerable commentary, most of it taking place in the post office or outside the church on Sunday mornings or over the back fence between neighboring gardens. Mrs. Opal Delaney, who ran the boarding house where Maria had lived for the past 2 years, held the most powerful opinion on the matter, as Mrs. Delaney held the most powerful opinion on most matters. She was a woman of 60 with silver hair and sharp black eyes, and the kind of moral clarity that came from having survived a husband, a cholera epidemic, and 3 consecutive bad cattle years, and her verdict on Hugh Barnett was delivered to anyone who would listen. He wronged her in the worst way a man can wrong a woman without leaving a mark, Mrs. Delaney said. He made her believe she was loved when what she was convenient. And now he's come back and bought himself a piece of land and expects, what? To be let back in like a cat that's been out in the rain. But Mrs. Delaney was also, beneath her moral clarity, a woman with a romantic streak she would have died before admitting to, and she had seen the way Maria sometimes paused in whatever she was doing when Hugh's horse passed on the road beyond the boarding house window, that small, involuntary stillness, and she said nothing about that to anyone. The women's sewing circle, which met on Thursday afternoons at the church, was more divided. Clara Holt thought Hugh should be run out of town on principle. Beatrice Ruiz, whose own marriage had survived considerable complicated weather, thought people deserved second chances if they'd done genuine work to deserve them. Young Nettie Foss, who was 19 and recently engaged, and therefore an authority on all things romantic, thought it was the most heartbreaking and thrilling situation she had ever heard of. Maria did not attend the sewing circle. She had stopped going 2 years ago, when the silence had made the social navigation of it too complicated. But she heard things, because small towns are composed largely of the things people tell each other, and those things have a way of finding their destinations. What she had not expected was to be confronted with Hugh Barnett one evening on the road to the river. She went to the river almost every evening in fine weather, walking the half-mile of track through the cedar scrub to the wide, flat bank where the picos ran shallow and clear over pale stones. She went because it was the one place in Redemption Creek where she could be entirely alone, where there was nothing asked of her and nothing to manage, where the sound of the water and the enormous Texas sky made the silence inside her feel less like a wound and more like something chosen. She came around the bend in the track and found him sitting on the root of a large cottonwood at the river's edge, elbows on his knees, looking at the water. He had not heard her coming, or if he had not moved, and she stopped when she saw him, uncertain for the first time whether to stay or go. He looked up then. His expression, caught unguarded, was one she had never quite seen on him before. He looked weary, but not the physical weariness of hard work. He looked weary in some deeper and more fundamental way, as if he had been carrying something for a long time and had simply sat down to rest for a moment without putting it down. He stood quickly when he saw her, the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to stand when a woman entered a room. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to. This is your place, isn't it? I can go." She shook her head. The small side-to-side motion which meant no, stay, or more precisely, don't on my account. He stood uncertainly for a moment, then sat again slowly, and she came and sat on a nearby rock a few feet away, and they both looked at the river. The sun was going down behind the cedar hills, turning the water gold, and a great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows upstream like a thought that hadn't quite formed yet. They sat like that for a long time. It was not entirely comfortable, but it was not unbearable. It was something in between, the way you sometimes sit with a piece of grief that you have not finished with yet but have at least learned to be in the same room with. After a while, Hugh said very quietly, not looking at her, "I've been trying to figure out the right thing to say for 2 years. I've written it out 100 times in my head, and every version sounds insufficient, because it is insufficient. There's no version of I'm sorry that's the right size for what I did." The heron lifted suddenly, great wings spreading, and crossed the river and disappeared into the cottonwoods on the other bank. Maria watched it go. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out the small notepad and pencil she always carried and wrote something and turned it toward him. He looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then he exhaled, slow and unsteady. She had written, "Why did you come back here? You could have settled anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. The river moved past them, gentle and indifferent. "Because," he said at last, "this is where I did the worst thing I've ever done. And I thought," he stopped. "Started again. I thought that if there was any way to do something right in this world, it would need to be somewhere near where I did something wrong. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you anything. I couldn't go somewhere new and pretend to be a new man without having at least tried to face what I was." Maria looked at him for a long time. Then she tucked the notepad back in her pocket and went back to watching the river, and after a while he did too, and they sat there until the sun was fully gone and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the bluffs. She walked back to town alone. He did not follow her. She noted this, and noted that she noted it. June came in with a heat that baked the red earth and shimmered above the road and made even the horses look philosophical. The cattle operation Hugh had begun on his land started to take shape. He had purchased a small herd from a ranch near Fort Stockton, 15 head of good mixed stock, and he had begun the slow, painstaking work of building something from nothing, which is always mostly about patience. Maria had begun to see him around town in the way you cannot help seeing someone in a small town, at the post office, at church on Sundays, which surprised her. She had not taken him for a church-going man, and perhaps he hadn't been before, at the blacksmith's where he came to have his horses shod. They had not spoken again, but a kind of understanding had developed between them, a mutual acknowledgement that the other existed and was not going to disappear, and that this fact needed to be accommodated somehow within the daily operations of living. It was Mrs. Delaney who first suggested the arrangement, though she presented it as a purely practical matter and would have been offended if you'd called it anything else. The boarding house's small vegetable garden, which supplied much of the kitchen and which Mrs. Delaney had relied on a hired man named Tomas to maintain, had lost Tomas to a better-paying job at the new mine opening up east of town. Mrs. Delaney needed someone to turn the soil and fix the garden fence and clear the weeds that had gotten ahead of her. Hugh Barnett, who was between intensive periods of work on his cattle operation, and had mentioned to Pete Garza that he was looking for ways to make himself useful around town, was suggested by Pete to Mrs. Delaney, who accepted the suggestion with the air of a woman doing a purely logistical calculation. So it was that Hugh began coming to the boarding house garden 3 mornings a week. And so it was that Maria, who took her breakfast at the boarding house kitchen table and then walked through the garden on her way to the store each morning, began to encounter him regularly, in the early light, while the air was still cool and smelled of damp earth, and the possibilities of the day hadn't yet been decided. The first morning, she passed through the garden while he was kneeling beside the bean rows and they exchanged a nod. The second morning, he was fixing the fence and she paused to look at what he was doing, and then pointed to where a lower board was also loose, and he said thank you and fixed that one too. Third morning, he had made 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen's perpetually hot pot with Mrs. Delaney's unspoken permission and set one on the garden gate post for her as she came through without looking up from the tomato steaks he was setting. She stopped. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He was still not looking at her. She took the cup and drank the coffee and went to work, and she thought about the gesture all morning, its smallness and its rightness, the fact that it had asked nothing of her. By July, the morning coffee was a habit. By August, they had developed a wordless grammar of small exchanges. He would point out interesting things to her: a hawk's feather, a peculiar stone, a monarch butterfly resting on the fence post. She would respond with a nod or a smile, or sometimes a line written on her notepad. He would read whatever she wrote with complete seriousness, as if the notepad were dispatches from a country he was trying to learn the language of. The town watched and murmured and said things into each other's ears. Mrs. Delaney watched from her kitchen window with an expression she would not have called hope. August brought a crisis that no one in Redemption Creek had anticipated. The bank in Fort Stockton, which held the note on Whitfield's dry goods, a note that Maria's father had taken out years ago and that she had been faithfully servicing, was bought by a larger banking concern out of Houston. The new owners sent an agent named Harlan Cord, a thin man in a good suit with the kind of smile that was all surface, and Cord reviewed the note and decided in his new concern way that the terms needed revising upward, significantly, immediately. Maria received the letter on a Thursday morning and read it 3 times. Then she sat down at the counter in the empty store and looked at the wall for a while. The new terms were not impossible, but they were difficult. She would need to increase her revenue or restructure the note or find additional capital from somewhere. The problem was that small towns in West Texas in 1879 did not have abundant sources of additional capital. The bank in Fort Stockton was the bank. There was no other. She spent that evening with her ledger books spread across the kitchen table in her boarding house room, working through the numbers with the careful precision she had learned from years of necessity. She could see a path through, a narrow one, requiring an expansion of the store's inventory to cover a wider territory, some kind of arrangement with the ranches outside town for bulk purchases of supplies, maybe a mail-order component if she could arrange reliable freight. It was possible. But she would need help with some of it, specifically the negotiating with the ranches, which required riding out to them and sitting down with ranch owners and talking, none of which she could do alone, not in her current condition of silence. She sat with this problem for 2 days, not mentioning it to anyone, which was consistent with her general approach to difficulties. Then, on the Saturday morning, she came through the boarding house garden where Hugh was harvesting the last of the summer squash, and instead of passing through, she stopped and opened her notepad to a fresh page and wrote for a considerable time, and then showed him what she'd written. He read it through once quickly and then again slowly. It was 3 paragraphs explaining the bank's situation, the terms, her analysis of possible solutions, and a carefully worded question about whether he might be willing, as someone who knew the cattle ranches and their owners in this territory, to accompany her on the visits she needed to make, speaking on her behalf when speaking was required, not as any kind of proprietor of her situation but as a professional associate. He looked up from the notepad and met her eyes. "I'll do it," he said simply. "Tell me when," she wrote. "Monday, if that's all right." "Monday," he agreed. They spent 3 Mondays and 1 Thursday riding out to the surrounding ranches, the Alvarez operation south of town, the Henderson Ranch to the north, a large spread called Silo Flat that was owned by the Wellborn brothers and had about 300 head of cattle and a crew of 15. Hugh rode his big gray and Maria rode a steady brown mare she borrowed from the livery, and they rode side by side through the cedar scrub and the creosote flats in the early morning cool, and on those mornings, the silence between them was different from any silence she had yet experienced. It was companionable. It breathed. At the ranches, Hugh did the talking as agreed, but he was careful and precise about it, consulting her at every step, translating her written notes to the ranchers and their wives with a directness and an honesty that she had not expected. He did not soften things or simplify them. He presented her business proposition in its full clarity and let the ranchers make up their own minds. 3 of the 4 ranches agreed to a bulk purchasing arrangement with Whitfield's dry goods. The 4th, Old Henderson, took another week to decide, and then sent his son into town with a signed agreement and his compliments. On the ride back from CeeLo Flat after the Wellborn brothers shook hands with Hugh and nodded at Maria, with the late afternoon sun on their backs and the smell of sage coming up from the dry creek bed they were crossing, Hugh said quietly, "You built something real here, Maria. That store and what's in it. You should be proud of it." She did not write anything. She just looked at him for a moment with something complicated moving across her face, and then looked back at the trail, and they rode the rest of the way home without speaking. But that evening, she noticed that the ledger numbers looked a little less frightening, and that there was something in the knowing that she had not had to face them alone that felt like a door opening, barely a crack, in a room she had kept sealed for a very long time. September in Redemption Creek was the season of dust and color, when the cedar hills went bronze, and the mornings came cold while the afternoons still burned, and the town settled into the particular rhythm of people preparing for winter. There was more work to do and less daylight to do it in, and a kind of productive urgency ran through everything, which suited Maria because busyness suited her. She had always done better with her hands occupied. The business arrangement with the ranches had been a success. The store's revenue was up considerably, and with careful management of the new terms, the banknote was serviceable. She had hired a part-time helper for the store, a quiet young woman named Adelina Ruiz, who was the daughter of Beatrice from the sewing circle and who was 17 and serious, and picked up the work with impressive speed. Having Adelina freed Maria to spend more time on the ledger and ordering side of things, which had expanded with the new arrangements. She was, by any observable measure, doing well. The silence continued, but it had changed in quality over the past months, had lost some of its desperate edge and become something less like a wall and more like a practice, a choice rather than a wound. She was not sure this was progress exactly, but it was different, and different, she had learned, was worth paying attention to. Hugh finished building a proper barn on his land through the September weeks, working with Pete Garza and a couple of extra hands from town. His cattle herd was growing slowly and healthily. He had gotten a reputation among the ranching community for fair dealing and a good eye for stock, which in this part of Texas was the equivalent of a strong character reference. He was becoming, in the way that takes years but starts from a single point, a man with a place in the world he was inhabiting. He came into the store on a Friday afternoon in mid-September for a pound of coffee and a tin of boot grease and a box of .44 cartridges. The store was busy. Adelina was helping 2 ranch wives with calico selections, and old Mr. Tibbetts was deliberating over tobacco varieties, with the concentration of a man making a very important decision. Maria moved around the shelves quietly, pulling Hugh's items and setting them on the counter. When she turned to write the total, he said, "I've been invited to a harvest gathering at the Wellborn place, next Saturday evening. Dancing, supper, the general celebration. I was told by both brothers independently that I should ask if you'd like to come." She looked at him. Then she looked at her notepad. She wrote, "Did they say anything else?" "They said, and I'm quoting directly, that bringing Maria Whitfield would be a notable improvement over coming alone, and that if I had any sense I'd do it." A brief, involuntary smile crossed her face. It was gone quickly, but it had been there, genuine and unguarded, and it left a warmth in its wake that she did not entirely know what to do with. She wrote, "I haven't been to a social gathering in some time." "I know," he said. "You don't have to go. I'll tell them you're busy." She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, "I'll go." He nodded, the careful, even nod of a man not allowing himself to show what he's feeling too plainly. "Saturday evening, then. I'll come by at 6. The Wellborn Harvest Gathering was held in the great cedar beam barn at CeeLo Flat, which had been swept and hung with lanterns, and decorated with dried corn husks and late-season sunflowers. About 60 people came from the surrounding area, families and ranch hands, and a handful of town folk. And the Wellborn brothers' wives had organized a supper table that went the full length of one wall, and held more food than Maria had seen in one place, since she'd been a child watching her mother prepare Christmas dinner. There was a fiddle player named Santos, and a man who played harmonica and another with a guitar. And they set up in the corner and played the kind of music that makes your feet decide things before your brain has any input. The fast reels and the slow waltzes, and the in-between tunes that could be either if you chose. Maria wore her green dress, the good one she kept for church and the occasions that didn't come very often, and she had let her dark hair down in a way she hadn't in months. And when she came down the boarding house stairs to where Hugh was waiting in the front hall with his hat in his hands, she saw him look at her with an expression he didn't manage to arrange quickly enough, something open and unguarded and very sincere. He said, "You look," and then stopped, as if the available words were inadequate. "You look well," he finished, which was not what he had started to say, and they both knew it. She wrote on her notepad, "You look like you combed your hair, which is an improvement." He laughed, sudden and genuine, and it was, even now, even after everything, the sound she remembered, warm and deep and impossible to resist. At the gathering, people were kind. The well-born wives drew Maria into the supper preparations with the easy naturalness of women who know how to make space for someone without making a fuss about it. The ranch hands treated her with a respectful distance. A few of the town folk who were there offered the careful, warm greetings she had learned to receive gracefully. She moved through the evening on her notepad and her smiles, and the particular eloquence of a woman who has learned that expression comes in many forms. Hugh stayed near her without hovering, which was a skill, and one she noticed. He danced with the well-born wives when asked and talked cattle and weather with the ranch hands and ate 2 helpings of the beef stew with apparent sincerity, and checked on Maria with a kind of unobtrusive attentiveness that was nothing like the vigilant control of a man who wants to manage a woman, and everything like the care of a person who has simply decided that another person's comfort matters to them. Partway through the evening, Santos and his companions struck up a waltz. It was slow and sweet, and the lantern light moved over the barn in long, warm sweeps, and several couples moved to the open space in the middle of the floor. Hugh looked at her. He held out his hand. Not an assumption, more of a question, his brows slightly raised, his expression asking, leaving the answer entirely to her. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about all the versions of this moment she had imagined and feared, and refused to hope for in the long, dark months of the past 2 years. Then she put her hand in his. He danced the way he did everything physical, with a quiet competence that didn't call attention to itself, and she followed him easily, as if her body had not forgotten what it was to move with someone, to trust someone with the simple mechanics of a waltz. They kept appropriate distance. His hand was warm at her waist. The music moved through the barn and the lantern swayed, and the night outside was enormous and star-filled and fully, absolutely indifferent to the small specific drama playing out in one person's chest. When the music stopped, he stepped back and she stepped back, and they were standing in the middle of the well-born barn floor with their hands just separating, and neither of them saying anything. And it was the most eloquent silence she had inhabited in 2 years. In October, Redemption Creek had its own small crisis in the form of a drought that cut the river to half its usual flow and dried up 3 of the wells on the south side of town. The Mexican families in that quarter of town had the worst of it. Several households had no water access at all, and the town's response to this was mixed, which is to say that some people helped and some people found reasons not to, which in 1879 in West Texas was not a surprise but was still, Maria thought with a cold clarity, an injustice. She opened the store early every morning that month to allow the families from the south side to fill their water barrels from the store's cistern, which was connected to a better well. She also organized, through written notes delivered by Adelina, who had a gift for logistics, a rotating schedule of water transport using 3 of the town's wagons. She did not ask permission for this from anyone who might have said no. She simply set it up and made it happen, and the people it helped were grateful, And the people who thought she shouldn't have bothered said what they thought to each other and not to Maria, because Maria Whitfield's silence, paradoxically, had given her a kind of authority that made people think twice before saying unhelpful things to her face. Hugh drove one of the water wagons himself, twice a week, without being asked, having heard about the arrangement from Pete Garza. He showed up on the first morning with his wagon and his gray horse and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and simply joined the operation, and nobody said anything about it except Mrs. Delaney, who said, from her front porch as he drove past, "About time someone with a wagon and sense showed up," which was, from Mrs. Delaney, essentially a commendation. The rains came in November and the river came back up and the wells refilled and the crisis resolved. But something had shifted during those weeks, some understanding among the people of Redemption Creek about who could be relied upon. Maria had always been relied upon. But Hugh Barnett was earning it slowly, in the way you earn a thing by showing up for it day after day without requiring acknowledgement. The winter of 1879 came in cold and clear, the kind of West Texas winter that smells of cedar smoke and feels like the whole world has gone to its bones. Maria had been thinking, for several weeks, about something she could not quite formulate even on paper, a kind of internal reckoning that kept arriving at the edges of her consciousness and retreating before she could look directly at it. It had to do with the silence. Not the cause of it, which she understood well enough, but the continuation of it, the question of whether the silence, which had begun as a response to injury, had somewhere along the way become a choice she was making not out of pain, but out of a habit she had forgotten to examine. She thought about this while she organized inventory, and while she lay awake in the dark of her boarding house room, and while she sat at the river in the cold afternoons, watching the picos move low and ice-clear over its pale stones. She thought about the fact that Hugh had been in Redemption Creek for 7 months. She thought about what she had observed in those 7 months, which was considerable. A man doing the difficult and unglamorous work of becoming better than he had been, not for applause, not for her, but because he had apparently decided it was necessary. She thought about the waltz in the Wellborn barn and the cup of coffee on the fence post in the garden and the notepad read with complete seriousness. She thought about the water wagons in October. She thought about herself. About the woman she had been before February of 1877, who had been direct and capable and not afraid of her own voice, who had spoken her mind in the store and at town meetings and at supper tables without the slightest hesitation. She thought about whether that woman was gone or only waiting. She thought about whether silence, taken long enough, becomes its own kind of dishonesty. The first real cold snap of the winter came on a Thursday in early December, dropping temperatures so fast that by midday you could see your breath in the unheated back room of the store. Maria wore her heaviest wool and kept the stove cranked up and sent Adelina home early because the girl had a cold and the cold air wasn't helping. She was alone in the store late afternoon when Hugh came in. She had not seen him for 4 days, which was unusual. He had been out at his land dealing with a fence situation that the cold snap had worsened, a long section of posts heaved by the frozen ground that needed resetting before his cattle drifted. He looked tired, the good tired of physical work, and cold, his coat caked at the collar with something that was probably mud from the fence post resetting. He came to the counter and bought a tin of tobacco and some writing paper and 2 candles, and while she was totaling the purchase, he said, quietly almost to himself, "I got a letter from my sister in Virginia. She wants to know when I'm coming home. She thinks Texas is no place for a man of sense." Maria wrote, "What did you tell her?" "I told her Texas is exactly the place for me for reasons I'm not ready to explain in a letter." She looked at that for a moment, then wrote, "Is that true?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, just the one word, but the weight of it was considerable. She gave him his change and he took it, and he was turning to go when she did something she had not planned. She picked up the notepad and wrote something and reached across the counter and held it out to him before she had fully decided to. He turned back and took it and read it. His expression shifted slowly, the way weather shifts over a landscape when a front is coming. She could see something moving in him, something careful and large and not entirely controlled. She had written, "I don't think you should have to explain it in a letter. I think you already explained it to me 7 months ago, and I think I've been thinking about it ever since." He set the notepad down on the counter very carefully, as if it were something fragile. He did not say anything for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice was lower than usual and it had something rough and honest in it. "Maria, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that whatever you feel about it, I'll accept. You owe me nothing. There's no debt here that runs in your direction." She folded her hands on the counter and waited. "I've loved you since about the 4th time I walked through that door," he said, "and I know I lost the right to say that. I know the whole shape of what I did, and I know there's a fair argument that I should never say it again. But I've done enough of not saying true things, and I'm not going to do that anymore." He paused. "You don't have to respond to that. You don't have to do anything. I just needed to say it once honestly so it wasn't another secret." The store was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the December wind moved down the street and the bare cottonwood branches above the livery swayed and steadied. Maria looked at Hugh Barnett standing on the other side of her counter with his tired, honest face and his muddy coat and his tobacco and his writing paper. And she felt something that she had been keeping very carefully under the weight of 2 years of silence finally reach the surface. "Break it, breathe." She opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came out, was rough from disuse, the way a door sounds when it opens after a long time of being shut. It was barely above a whisper, and it was not a long sentence, but it was real and it was hers, and it was the first thing she had said in 2 full years. She said, "I know." Hugh went absolutely still. He looked at her as if she were something he was afraid to look away from in case it disappeared. His jaw was working slightly, the muscles in it tightening and releasing, and his eyes had gone bright with something he was clearly trying to manage with what dignity he could. "Maria," he said, very low. That was me," she said. Still rough, still barely above a whisper, but steadier now, as if the door had found its hinges. "And I know what you said, and I know what I've been thinking for 7 months, and I know what I feel, and She stopped. Her voice broke, not into silence but into something else, something thick with all the months and all the locked-up words. "I'm very tired of not saying true things either." He stood there for a moment more, completely still, and then he reached across the counter and she reached back, and his hand closed around hers on the cold wooden counter of Whitfield's dry goods, and they held on to each other in the December afternoon, and the stove ticked on, and the December wind moved outside, and something that had been broken for 2 years began, very slowly and very carefully, to consider the possibility of being whole again. He came back that evening. She was closing the store, turning the lamp down and pulling her shawl tight against the cold, when she heard his knock at the door. She opened it and he was standing there with 2 cups of coffee and a wire carrier. He'd gone to the hotel's kitchen and purchased them, and he held them out with a kind of diffident hope that was not like the easy confidence she had first known in him, and was therefore more interesting. She let him in and they sat in the store after hours. On the 2 chairs she kept behind the counter for the slow midday hours, and she talked. Not easily, at first. The voice was strange to her again after so long, and the words came out unevenly, like water from a pump that's been long dry, needing a few pulls before it runs clear. But she talked. She told him some things she'd never told anyone. About the night she'd read Eliza's name on that letter, what it had felt like, what specific version of devastation it had produced. She told him about the 2 years, what the silence had been and what it had meant, and when it had started to shift. She told him she was afraid, that the fear was not small, that what he had done had made her afraid of herself, of her own judgment, of whether she could trust what she felt for someone. He listened to all of it. He did not defend himself or explain anything. He just listened, and when she was done, or when she came to a natural pause, he said, "Thank you for telling me. I mean it." Every word of it is fair, and you deserve to have said it." They talked until the store was very cold and both their coffee cups were long empty. Then she walked him to the door and he stood in the doorway with the December stars enormous above the dark street and he said, "Can I come back tomorrow?" She thought about it for just a moment. Then she said, "Yes." The word, the simple one-syllable affirmation, felt like something remarkable. She thought it might always feel like something remarkable for a while. December unfolded around them like a slow gift. They met in the evenings, after the store closed, sometimes at the boarding house sitting room where Mrs. Delaney served them tea and pretended not to listen from the next room, sometimes at the store itself, sometimes on the cold walk along the river where their breath made clouds in the frigid air and their boots crunched the frost on the bank. Maria was talking. Not effusively, not the way some people talk, as if silence were an embarrassment to be filled as quickly as possible. She talked the way she did everything, with precision and purpose and a careful attention to what she was actually saying. But she was talking and the town noticed, and the town was quietly, warmly glad. Mrs. Delaney told no one anything, but she began making 2 cups of tea automatically when she heard the knock at the front door in the evenings, and she stocked the sitting room with better biscuits than she had previously thought necessary. Clara Holt maintained her position for about a week before Beatrice Ruiz pointed out to her privately that people contain multitudes, and that the measure of a man was what he did with his failures as well as his successes. And Clara, who was a fair-minded woman beneath her certainties, allowed that this was a reasonable point and modified her position, if not her scrutiny. Nettie Foss was simply and entirely delighted and told anyone who would listen. Christmas of 1879 was the best one Maria had spent in years. The town decorated the church and the main street with pine boughs from up in the hills, and the women organized a community supper that brought together more or less everyone in Redemption Creek, including the families from the South Quarter, which was better integrated this year than in previous ones. A progress that nobody officially acknowledged, but that was a progress nonetheless. Maria sat with Hugh at the community supper and they were simply, quietly there together, and the town absorbed this with a grace that surprised her a little. She had expected more complication. Perhaps the water wagon weeks had done something. Perhaps 2 years of watching her manage her silence with such dignity had done something. Perhaps people were simply, in the end, not entirely unkind. After the supper, they walked to the river in the Christmas night. The Pecos was frozen at the edges, and the stars were the kind you only get in a West Texas winter, a breathtaking excessive abundance of them above the dark hills. Hugh stood beside her at the water's edge and said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that the asking itself is already more than I deserve, and that the answer, whatever it is, will be right and I'll accept it." She turned to look at him. "Ask it," she said. He looked at the stars for a moment, then at her. "Will you let me try to earn you back, not quickly, not as if 2 years of trying makes it simple, but over whatever time it takes, as the man I'm trying to be, not the one I was?" She was quiet for a moment. The river moved quietly beneath its ice-edged banks, patient and continuous. The stars did their enormous, indifferent burning above the dark hills. "You already started," she said. 7 months ago, with a cup of coffee on a fence post. Something happened in his face then, a release of something that had been held very tight for a very long time, and he was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice was not quite steady. "I don't know what I did to get this kind of, you showed up," she said. "You kept showing up without asking for anything. That's not a small thing, Hugh." His name in her voice. She felt it land on him, saw him feel it. He reached out and she took his hand and they stood there in the Christmas night by the half-frozen Pecos River, holding on, and it was not a conclusion but a beginning, which is also a kind of gift. January brought snow, rare for this part of Texas, and therefore treated with the combined excitement and alarm of something that doesn't know the local protocols. 6 inches of it fell in 2 days, and the town became briefly, beautifully strange. the red earth hidden under white, the cedar scrub sagging under it, the limestone house on Hugh's land out on the flats looking like something from a picture in a magazine. Hugh's cattle managed the snow with the philosophical equanimity of animals that are better equipped for difficulty than people generally are. Maria walked to the river one afternoon during the snow and found it transformed, the banks white, the willows hung with ice, the water dark and almost silent. She thought it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, and she thought, immediately and without deciding to, that she wanted to tell Hugh about it. This struck her. The wanting to tell someone specific about a beautiful thing. She had forgotten what that was like, the particular quick impulse toward another person when you see something that moves you. She had been without it for 2 years, and its return was like the return of feeling to a limb that has been asleep. Strange and not entirely comfortable at first, but unmistakably life. She found him that evening at the boarding house sitting room where they had taken to meeting, and she described the river and the snow to him in detail, the white banks and the ice-hung willows and the dark water between, and he listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on her face, the way he listened to everything she said now, with the focused attention of a man who knows that what he is hearing is a gift he has not fully deserved and intends to honor. "I want to see it," he said. "Tomorrow," she said, "before the thaw." And so the next morning they walked together to the river in the snow, side by side in the blue early light, their breaths rising in small clouds, and she showed him the thing she had seen, and he stood beside her looking at it with an expression that was uncomplicated and real. And she thought, standing there in the transformed cold world, that she was going to be all right. Not in the way she had been all right during the 2 years of silence, that careful, constructed all right of a person managing their way through damage, but in a deeper way, a way that had something to do with allowing herself to need another person again. The February cold broke slowly into a tentative spring, and the river flats beyond town turned green in a way that seemed improbable after the winter, that hopeful annual miracle that the land performs whether anyone is watching or not. Hugh's cattle grazed on the new grass, and he had more calves than expected from the season, which was a good sign for the operation's future. Maria's store had turned its best quarterly numbers since she'd inherited it. The ranch supply arrangements had been profitable. The banknote was ahead of its revised schedule, and she had been able to order a wider selection of goods that were drawing customers from further out. She had also begun to speak in the store again, to customers and to Adelina and to the suppliers she dealt with, and it turned out that her voice, once recovered, was as clear and direct as it had always been, and that speaking was easier than she had expected now that it was a choice rather than a default. In March, Hugh rode out to a cattle auction in Midland and came back with 2 new horses for his remuda and a very fine hand-stitched saddle for Maria's brown mare, and when he presented the saddle at the livery where the mare was kept, Maria looked at it for a moment and then looked at him and said, "Hugh, that's too much." "It's practical," he said. "You're riding out to those ranches regularly now. A good saddle is a practical matter." "It's beautiful," she said. "That's not the same as practical," he smiled, a small, private smile. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." She kept the saddle. In April, 1 year to the month from the day he had ridden back into Redemption Creek, they had the conversation that had been gathering for months at the edges of everything they said and did not say. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house in the evening warmth, the first genuinely warm evening of the year, with the smell of new grass on the air and the sky going purple and gold beyond the hills. "I've been thinking," Hugh said, "about asking you something important, and I've been not asking it because I wanted to be sure that when I did I was asking it from the right place." She looked at him. "What place is that?" "Not from wanting to fix what I did," he said, "not from guilt, but from," he stopped, looked for the right word, "from certainty about what I want and what I believe is possible and what I think we could be." She waited. "Maria Whitfield," he said, "will you marry me?" She was quiet. Not the old silence, not the locked and wounded silence of 2 years. This was the quiet of a woman thinking clearly about something important. "You know," she said after a moment, "for a long time I thought the reason I couldn't forgive you was because of what you did to me. And I think some of it was, but I think some of it was also that I couldn't forgive myself for not knowing, for not seeing it." "That's not something you need to forgive yourself for," he said quietly. "I worked very hard to make sure you didn't see it. That was my choice, my fault." "I know," she said. "I've come to know that. It's taken me a while." She looked at the purple and gold sky. The first star had appeared, that early single star that shows up before the others as if scouting. "You asked me if I'd let you earn me back," she said. "And you have, Hugh. You've been doing it all year, and you have. So yes, yes, I'll marry you." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them that she recognized as the real version of the man she'd fallen in love with in the first place, the man beneath the surface that she now knew was true. He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a ring, a simple band of gold with a small garnet set in it, warm red in the evening light. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "It's the one thing I had from my family that meant anything. I'd like you to have it if you'll take something of mine." She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. They sat on the boarding house porch in the warm April evening, her hand in his, the star above the hills keeping its early solitary watch, and the town of Redemption Creek went about its evening business around them, and the Pecos River ran over its pale stones 2 miles distant, and the Cedar Hills breathed in the early spring dark, and it was, in every way that mattered, a beginning. They were married in June of 1880, on a Saturday morning at the small white church at the edge of Redemption Creek, with the whole town in attendance, and the June light coming through the church windows in long golden bars, and the June smell of wild sage and river water on the warm air. The Reverend, who had privately had his own evolution of opinion on Hugh Barnett over the course of the previous year, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Maria wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in a cedar chest for years, white lawn with small blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she wore it with the garnet ring on her right hand, moved there for the ceremony, and the new ring Hugh gave her, a wider gold band, on her left. Her dark hair was pinned up with her mother's small pearl combs. She carried a bunch of wild columbine tied with white ribbon that Hugh had found growing along the creek bed and picked himself that morning before dawn. When the Reverend reached the part of the ceremony about speaking, Hugh looked at Maria with an expression that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life, open and steady and very, very serious, as if every word he was about to say was the most important word he had ever spoken, and he made his vows in a clear, unhurried voice. When it was her turn, Maria looked at Hugh Barnett standing in the gold light of the church with his hands holding hers, and she spoke her vows in her own clear voice, and each syllable felt like something restored, like the particular quality of a thing that has been reclaimed and is therefore more precious than it was the first time. Mrs. Delaney, in the second pew, was entirely composed until the moment they kissed, and then she was not, and she produced a handkerchief from her sleeve with the decisiveness of a woman who has given up on pretense. Nettie Foss wept openly and without embarrassment, which was entirely in character. Beatrice Ruiz smiled at her husband beside her, and he took her hand, and they both thought privately of their own complicated road, and were glad. The wedding supper was held outside in the summer warmth, long tables set up in the churchyard, enough food for twice the assembled company, fiddle music and dancing until the stars were fully out. Maria danced with Hugh 3 times, including once to the same slow waltz that Santos had played at the Wellborn gathering, and this time there was nothing tentative in it, no careful distance to manage, just the uncomplicated rightness of two people who have found their way to each other through considerable difficulty, and have decided, with full knowledge of all the costs, to stay. They moved into Hugh's limestone house on the flats above the Pecos. It was, Maria thought, the most beautiful house she had ever lived in, with its thick stone walls that stayed cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and its 4 solid rooms, and its covered porch facing the river. She brought from the boarding house her books and her ledger and her mother's cedar chest, and the small watercolor painting of Virginia hills that her father had given her mother, and she placed these things in the new rooms, and they looked, immediately and entirely, as if they had always been there. She kept the store. This had never been in question between them. It was hers, had been hers through all the difficult years, and she had made something real of it, and she was not going to stop now. She rode the brown mare with the beautiful hand-stitched saddle into town each morning, and managed the store with Adelina's help, and came home in the evenings to the limestone house, and the porch that smelled of sage, and the man who had, in the end, proved himself worthy of the second chance she had extended him. Hugh's cattle operation grew through the summer and fall of 1880, steadily and without drama, which is the best way for any worthwhile thing to grow. He added more stock, built a second barn, hired 2 full-time hands, young men, brothers, from a ranch family to the south who had recently lost their land and needed the work. He treated them fairly and paid them on time, and included them in the operations decisions to the degree that their experience warranted, and they stayed, and the operation became something real. In the early spring of 1881, Maria told Hugh on the limestone porch in the morning cold that she was carrying their child. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, the same thunder-in-a-canyon laugh that had first undone her 5 years ago, and she laughed too, which surprised her a little, the ease of it. The way laughter had come back to her since the voice, since the ring, since the porch and the morning coffee and all the small accumulated dailiness of their life. He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "I've been thinking names." "Of course you have," he said, with the warmth of a man who knows a woman thoroughly and finds what he knows entirely fine. "If it's a boy," she said, "I'd like to call him Daniel, after my father." "Daniel," he said, and the name sat well in the morning air. "And if it's a girl, Clara," she said, "after Mrs. Holt." He looked at her. "Clara Holt, who spent most of a year convinced I should be run out of town." "Clara Holt, who has very good judgment and eventually applied it," Maria said, "and who has been very kind to me." He nodded slowly. "Daniel or Clara," he said. "Those are good names." Daniel Hugh Barnett arrived in October of 1881, healthy and loud, and in possession of his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the town of Redemption Creek received him with appropriate celebration. Mrs. Delaney knitted him a blanket in white and blue wool. Beatrice Ruiz brought tamales. Clara Holt brought a carefully chosen selection of children's books, and nobody laughed at the irony of this, not even Maria, who was too busy being profoundly happy to have room for irony. The boy was a wonder. He slept in the cedar cradle that Hugh had made over 2 weekends in the barn, working by lamplight in the evenings with a care and precision that Maria had watched through the window with her heart doing quiet things. He grew with the unstoppable efficiency of new things, gaining size and awareness and personality at a rate that seemed impossible to track. Maria nursed him and sang to him and read to him from the very beginning, the same poetry and stories her father had read to her, and also the practical things, the animal names and the plant names, and the names of the stars that wheeled above the limestone house on clear nights. Hugh sat with them in the evenings, reading or simply present, and watched his wife and his son with the particular expression of a man who knows that he has been given something beyond his calculation. In the spring of 1882, something happened that closed the last open wound in the history between them, or rather, that allowed Maria to close it in a way she had not previously been ready to. She had been writing a letter to a cousin in Virginia, a routine correspondence, and she had found herself, for the first time, describing her life in full. Not the carefully edited version she had been sending for the past few years, the functional account of the store and the town, but the real version, the silence and what had caused it and what had ended it, and the man she had married, and the house, and the boy, and the morning coffee, and the evening porch. She wrote it all down, and in the writing of it she arrived, almost by surprise, at the realization that what she felt about all of it, the whole complicated history, including the worst of it, was not the managed peace of a woman who has made the best of things, but the real peace of a woman who has come through something true. She showed Hugh the letter before she sent it. It was a private thing to share, and she knew that, but she also knew that it contained a description of him that she wanted him to hear, a description that she had written without any intention of him seeing, and that for that reason was more honest than anything she might have said directly. He read it at the kitchen table while Daniel slept in the next room. He read it all the way through, and when he was done, he set it down carefully on the table and didn't say anything for a long moment. "Maria," he said finally, "I want to say something to you that I've said before, but I want to say it again now because I think it means something different to me now than it did when I first said it." She waited. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not in the way I said it when I came back. I was sorry then because of what I'd done. I'm sorry now because of what I understand it cost you. There's a difference. The first kind of sorry is about me. This one is about you." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she had chosen, had reclaimed, had built something real within this limestone house above the Pecos River. "I know," she said, "and I forgive you, entirely. Not as something I've been saving up to say. I forgave you somewhere around the time you put the coffee on the fence post and didn't wait to see if I'd thank you for it. I've just been letting it settle." He reached across the table and she took his hand, and they sat in the morning kitchen of their home with their son asleep in the next room, and the spring light coming through the windows and the smell of coffee and new grass on the air, and it was exactly, precisely, what home ought to feel like. The summer of 1882 was a good one. The cattle operation produced well. The store had its best year to date, and Maria had brought in a small but reliable postal agency as part of its services, which old Mr. Tibbets had cheerfully retired from, and which added both business and a natural gathering point for the town's commerce. Adelina had proven so indispensable that Maria had given her a formal partnership stake in the store's profits, which Adelina received with the quiet dignity of a young woman who had expected to earn it and was glad to see the ledger agree. Hugh's two ranch hands, the brothers Ernesto and Felipe Castillo, had become in the course of 2 years a genuine part of the operation and of the rhythm of the place. Ernesto was 22 and had the beginnings of a cattle instinct that Hugh told Maria privately was the best natural ability he'd seen in anyone under 30. Felipe was 19 and had a gift for horses that bordered on the inexplicable, and the horses on the Barnett Ranch were, as a result, the best-handled animals in the county. In August of 1882, Hugh received a letter from a land agent in Fort Stockton about an adjacent parcel of land that had come available, 40 acres, immediately to the east of his existing holding, backing up against the Cedar Bluffs, with a seasonal creek and good pasture, and a price that was higher than he'd have liked but not impossible. He sat with the numbers for 2 evenings, working through them with the same ledger discipline Maria had taught him over the past 2 years. On the 3rd evening, he set the papers in front of her at the kitchen table. She put on her reading glasses. She'd needed them for the past year, a fact she had accepted with reasonable grace, and read through the agent's letter and the price and the description of the land. "What do you think?" he said. "I think," she said, "that the creek means summer water, which is more valuable than the price acknowledges. And I think the bluff land will run cedar, which you can clear and plant in 2 seasons. And I think we can afford it if we restructure the note on the current mortgage to a slightly longer term, which the bank has already indicated they'd consider." "The store's in a good position," he said. "Would you—" "Yes," she said. "We go together or not at all." He looked at her for a moment. "Us and Daniel and the operation and the store," he said. "We've built something real." "We have," she agreed. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the table and looked at him with the steadiness she had always had, that deep, composed attention that he had fallen in love with in the first place, and that years and silence and grief and recovery had only made more itself. "We've built something that will last." They bought the land. The additional 40 acres were absorbed into the operation by the spring of 1883, and by that spring, it was clear to both of them that they would need to expand the operation's human resources, which led to the hiring of 2 more hands and the building of a bunkhouse on the property that was, Hugh insisted, properly constructed and properly maintained, because people who work for you deserve adequate housing as a matter of simple decency. Maria was carrying their second child by that spring, and she managed both the store and the early months of the pregnancy with the same organizational efficiency she brought to everything, which occasionally exasperated Hugh, who had opinions about rest and moderation that she found endearing but not entirely binding. "You are not required," he said one morning in March, watching her mount the brown mare to ride to the store, "to work as if you are competing with someone." "I'm not competing," she said. "I'm keeping inventory of the spring order shipment so that Adelina doesn't have to do it alone, and then I'm coming home for lunch." "You'll stay for the afternoon," he said. She looked down at him from the saddle. "Hugh Barnett," she said, "I have been managing this store for 7 years without assistance. I think I can manage a Wednesday morning." "You had assistance," he said. "Eventually." She smiled at him, that smile that was still not common enough to take for granted, that particular private smile she gave him in moments when she was both exasperated and pleased at once. "Eventually," she agreed. "Now move out of the way of the horse." She came home for lunch. She also stayed for the afternoon, which she chose to do herself and which she told him, when he appeared at the front door of the store at 4 o'clock with that careful expression, was entirely her own decision and not a concession to his worrying. "Of course," he said, and held the door open for her. Their daughter arrived in the late summer of 1883. She was born at home, in the limestone house, in the big bedroom with the windows that looked out over the river flats, on a clear, warm August night with the stars enormous above the dark hills. The midwife, a capable Tejana woman named Rosa who had delivered most of the children in the county for the past 15 years, declared her a fine and healthy girl, and Daniel, who was not quite 2 and therefore only vaguely conversant with what was happening, was brought in to see her with an expression of profound philosophical consideration. They named her Clara, as Maria had said they would. Clara Whitfield Barnett turned out to have her father's chestnut hair and her mother's dark eyes, which was a combination that Rosa declared was going to cause considerable trouble in about 16 years, and everyone agreed she was probably right. The years that followed were not without difficulty. This was Texas in the 1880s, and difficulty was structural to the landscape. There were dry years and cattle prices that fell, and a bad spring in 1885 when a flash flood took out the lower pasture fence, and they lost 8 head of cattle before the water receded. There was a winter in 1886 when Daniel had a fever that lasted 3 weeks and frightened both his parents badly before it broke. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher over a boundary line that required 2 lawyers and most of a summer to resolve. But there was also the morning coffee ritual, kept through all the years, that quiet shared beginning of each day. There was the evening porch and the stars and the ongoing conversation between 2 people who had each discovered, through some considerable difficulty, how to be honest with the other. There was the store, flourishing, a genuine institution of Redemption Creek's commerce and community. There was the cattle operation, modest but sound, with Ernesto Castillo becoming so capable that Hugh had brought him into the operation as a partner in all but formal paperwork, and had begun the conversations about what formal paperwork would look like. There was Daniel, growing into a serious and curious child, with a gift for mathematics that came from somewhere, and a love of horses that came clearly from watching Felipe Castillo all his early years. There was Clara, fierce and clear-eyed and possessed of an opinion on everything, which she had apparently inherited equally from both parents and combined into something singular. In the fall of 1887, Maria walked to the Pecos River on a Sunday afternoon, which she still did, because some things that sustain you are worth keeping regardless of how the rest of life changes around them. She sat on the same wide flat bank where she had sat alone in the 2 years of silence, and she looked at the water moving over the pale stones, and she thought about all of it, the whole long story from the beginning to where she was now. She had been silent for 2 years. The silence had been a wound and then a practice and then a choice, and when it had finally broken, what had come out of it had been something that remade both of them. She had thought once that what Hugh had done was the worst thing that could happen to her, and it had been, at the time, a kind of destruction. But she had also come to understand, in the long, patient way that understanding comes to people who are willing to sit with difficult things, that survival of destruction is also a kind of instruction, that you come through the other side knowing things about yourself that you could not have learned any softer way. She heard his boots on the path behind her, and she did not turn around. She listened to him come down the bank and sit beside her on the rock she'd chosen, which was large enough for two and always had been. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water the way she was. Then he said, "Daniel asked me this morning where we met." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you came to your store and I walked through the door and that was it." He looked back at the river. "Which is true as far as it goes." "As far as it goes," she agreed. He wanted to know if it was like the stories, lightning and all. Was it? Hugh looked at her, and there was in his face that open, uncalculated expression she had come to know as the truest thing he had, the one he wore when he had stopped managing what he felt and was simply feeling it. "It was better than the stories," he said. "The stories don't include everything that comes after. They stop at the easy part." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the Pecos River, moving over its pale stones in the afternoon light, patient and continuous and entirely itself. "Yes," she said, "they do." He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and they sat together at the river in the late fall afternoon. This man and this woman who had made their way through the hardest kind of country, not the red dirt and limestone kind, but the internal kind. The country of damage and silence and the long work of becoming trustworthy again, and who had found on the other side of all of it something that the stories about lightning and doorways don't usually have room for. The ordinary, daily, extraordinary grace of a life built carefully by two people with their eyes open. The water moved, the light fell. The cedar hills went bronze in the afternoon, the way they always did in October. And above the town of Redemption Creek, the sky was that particular shade of West Texas blue that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth, that impossibly deep clear blue that makes everything below it look as though it has been placed exactly where it belongs. Behind them, up the path through the scrub, the limestone house sat solid in the afternoon light, the house with the 4 rooms and the covered porch and the cedar cradle, long outgrown in the corner of what was now Daniel's room. Inside, Clara was probably doing something she had been told not to, and Daniel was probably reading something he had borrowed from the school without asking, and the kitchen still smelled of the morning's coffee, and there was a pot of something good on the stove for supper, and later there would be lamplight and voices, and the sound of children being put to bed, and the long quiet of the evening porch. None of it was simple. None of it had been given. All of it had been earned, in the slow, hard currency of honesty and patience, and showing up in the willingness to speak when speaking is needed, even after 2 years of silence, especially then, especially the moment when you open your mouth in the cold December afternoon of a general dry goods store, and say 2 words that break something open in the person listening and begin the long work of healing you both. I know. 2 words. Maria Whitfield, who had been silent for 2 years, had broken that silence with 2 words, and they had been the right ones, not because they were eloquent or complex, but because they were true, and because sometimes the truest thing you can say to a person is that you see them, that you have been paying attention, that even in the silence you were present, and that you are ready at last to speak. The river ran on. The stars came out, one by one, over the cedar hills. And the limestone house on the flats above the Picos held its lights in the dark, warm and full and entirely, unmistakably home.